What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be looking at the relationship between dead silence and acoustic sensor in Black Ops 4. For those of you guys that don't know, dead silence has kind of become a crutch perk for me. I use it on basically all of my classes, and a lot of people have been asking me why, and hopefully this video should clear a few things up, because we will also see the power of acoustic sensor, and these kind of work against each other. So dead silence is a perk that makes your footsteps quieter, and it also at least somewhat counters the acoustic sensor's sixth sense ability, where they can see the direction an enemy is coming from on the minimap. Now, acoustic sensor is kind of like awareness or amplify from the past, where it will actually make enemy footsteps louder, and like I just explained, it also gives you that sixth sense ability on the minimap that allows you to see the direction the enemy players are coming from. So first we're going to have a look at the relationship between the different sounds of the footsteps, then we'll get into the actual sensor itself and the different ranges and everything that goes along with that. With this video, I feel it is pretty important to have some way of turning up your audio or plug in a headset or some earbuds or something, because it really does rely on your ability to hear the sound. But first, we're going to have a look at the baseline. This is what happens when the enemy isn't running dead silence and I'm not running acoustic sensor. Pay really close attention to the moment that you can first hear the footsteps, and then also try to pay attention to the volume of those footsteps as they get closer. So as you can probably tell, the footsteps are actually quite audible in this game. You can hear people coming if they're not using dead silence fairly easily, at least when you're in a quiet moment. Of course, a lot of times in the middle of a game, you got gunshots going off everywhere and explosions and streaks being called in and all that kind of stuff. But at least in a controlled environment, if things are quiet, you can definitely hear those footsteps coming. And this was the approximate range that I first heard the footstep against a person that doesn't have dead silence when I'm not using acoustic sensor. It's approximately 30 meters when the enemy is sprinting, which is a pretty decent range. So that's the baseline, but now let's move on to what it sounds like against somebody that does have dead silence when I'm not using acoustic sensor. So if you're listening really carefully, you can tell that obviously the range is reduced significantly, the volume is also reduced significantly, but dead silence doesn't make you dead silent. You still make a very small amount of noise, but you also have to be in extremely close proximity to your enemy for them to hear you. So if you're running right up behind a guy, he might catch just that faintest amount of noise to be able to turn around and get some shots on you. But more often than not, you will end up getting the jump on somebody if you're using dead silence, especially when we're talking about a real situation where there is gunfire and other noises going on around the map. But in this situation, I was able to hear that first footstep very faintly at approximately 4 to 5 meters away, which was a very significant reduction in the amount of sound that you make. So that's dead silence. Now let's bring acoustic sensor into the mix, and for right now, remember, we're not really focusing on the sensor ranges, we're just focusing on the footsteps. So focus more on the sound than the visuals at this point, but have a listen to just how far you can hear somebody's footsteps when you're using acoustic sensor and they aren't using dead silence. Now you can probably tell right there that that was a massive increase to the range that you can hear footsteps, as well as the overall volume of the footsteps around you. This was the distance that I was able to hear that first footstep, and I have to actually zoom in so you can see exactly where the enemy is. It appears that the enemy was more than 50 meters away from me when I was able to hear their footsteps while sprinting. So on a smaller map, you'll be able to hear every enemy on the map. It's just, that's going to be a lot of information to be really processing all at once if there's a bunch of enemies running all over the place. So not even mentioning acoustic sensor's sixth sense ability on the minimap, you can see just how powerful it is when it comes to hearing enemy footsteps. It's going to be very difficult for anybody to sneak up on you when you're using acoustic sensor, as long as you have a half-decent headset and some good map awareness. That is, unless the enemy is running dead silence. Now we're going to have a look at the relationship between these two. In this next clip, I will be running acoustic sensor and the enemy is running dead silence. Have a listen. That might have looked and sounded very familiar. I'm now going to play the first clip I showed in this video where neither of us have acoustic sensor or dead silence, and then right after that I'm going to play this clip again where I have acoustic sensor and the enemy has dead silence, and just have a listen and try and compare the two. Now, to me at least, those clips sound basically identical, and therefore it appears that Dead Silence and Acoustic Sensor, at least when it comes to footstep sounds, are perfect counters to each other. So it's as if you didn't have Acoustic Sensor and your enemy didn't have Dead Silence. It's exactly the same, at least as far as I'm able to tell. So just taking a step back, these are the ranges that I plotted out for you guys on exactly how far away you're able to hear enemy footsteps when the enemy is sprinting. Of course, this will change depending on their stance. If they're crouched, they're going to be much more difficult to hear. And also if they're standing and they're basically running without actually sprinting, they will also be a bit quieter. But at least while sprinting, these are the ranges that you'd be able to realistically hear enemy players. So even just looking at that, you can see why I really like Dead Silence. It's a great counter to Acoustic Sensor. Yes, they'll still be able to hear your footsteps, but I think most of the time they're expecting those really loud footsteps, and therefore they usually don't hear me coming anyways, or they don't react in the right way when they hear me coming with Dead Silence. In addition to that, I think one of the things I really like about Dead Silence is I don't have to hear my own footsteps when I'm moving around the map, and this allows me to hear enemy footsteps a lot easier because it's just less sound for me to have to sift through. Now, of course, there is another element we're going to be looking at in this video, and this is Acoustic Sensor's Sixth Sense sort of ability. I call it Sixth Sense ability because it's basically like Sixth Sense from Black Ops 3, where when an enemy gets close to you, you will see on your minimap, you'll get an indicator that shows that there's an enemy in this general direction. It doesn't tell you exactly where that enemy is, it'll just tell you the general direction that they're approaching from. So let's have a look at the power of Acoustic Sensor's Sixth Sense ability. With this one, you don't have to worry about audio at all. Just focus on the minimap as well as the enemy player's positioning as he approaches me. We really want to focus on the exact range that it picks that enemy up. So if the enemy is sprinting and they don't have Dead Silence, this is the moment that they will show up on your minimap with Acoustic Sensor. It appears to be exactly 25 meters. Next, I wanted to test the range that you would pick somebody up if they weren't sprinting, but they were still standing and moving towards you. And I was actually quite surprised to see that it's the same range. I thought it would pick you up at a longer range if you were sprinting compared to if you were just walking or running around. Turns out it's the same range. However, when you crouch, this will significantly lower the range that the Acoustic Sensor will pick you up. As you can see here, it doesn't pick an enemy up until he gets this close to you while crouching. And it appears that this range is actually cut in half from the standing range, so it is a somewhat effective counter against somebody using Acoustic Sensor. If you don't happen to have Dead Silence on your class, and you just know that they're running Acoustic Sensor, you could be crouch walking around to try and half counter that, but at the same time, then you lose your mobility, so it's really going to be situation dependent for this. The much better counter is, you might have guessed it, Dead Silence. Let's have a look at the relationship between Acoustic Sensor and Dead Silence when it comes to this Sixth Sense ability. And as you can see here, even if an enemy with Dead Silence is sprinting at you and you have Acoustic Sensor, it doesn't pick them up until they get this close to you. By the time they get that close, normally there's no time to react, so Dead Silence is an excellent counter to this Sixth Sense ability as well. But of course, just to cover the bases, let's have a look at what happens when you're standing, and once again, no surprises here, it's the exact same range. Now let's have a look at a Dead Silence person if they are crouch walking towards you and see how that affects your Acoustic Sensor range. And it turns out it's actually the same as if you were sprinting or if you were just standing and walking towards the enemy. So it's a fixed range to pick up a Dead Silence user if they're coming at you. And you really don't know they're there until they're basically right on top of you. So as you can probably tell throughout this video, both Acoustic Sensor as well as Dead Silence are quite powerful in this game. If you're running Acoustic Sensor, it's going to be very difficult for an enemy to sneak up on you unless they're running Dead Silence. And if you're running Dead Silence, it's going to be very difficult for any enemy to detect you. Even if they're using Acoustic Sensor, normally you'll still get the jump on them with Dead Silence. So this is why I tend to run Dead Silence on basically all of my classes. Maybe I need to start getting into Acoustic Sensor a bit more often, but I just love my stim shot because I love getting back in the action as fast as possible after taking damage, and Acoustic Sensor doesn't allow you to do that. But of course, I'd like to know in the comment section below, what do you guys think about Acoustic Sensor as well as Dead Silence in this game? Do you think either of them are a crutch? Do you think you really need them all the time? Do you think there should be some sort of a change, like a buff or a nerf to either one of these abilities? Let me know what you guys are thinking down below, and since we almost got to that 10-minute mark and the algorithm really likes that, I'm going to play the raw clips again for you so you guys can hear those footstep sounds, so you can hear them like back to back to back. Of course, feel free to leave the video at this point if you're not interested in that. Maybe go watch another one of mine if you're interested. And I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll talk to you guys next time.